Thank you, everybody. Come to our June IJGIS webinar. Before the webinar, we were chatting about, I have to attest that movement science is on the rise, and we receive so many increase amount of manuscripts on this particular topic. And the four panelists we have today are really on the frontier of movement science and try to develop a scientific framework for analyzing movement in terms of a human mobility or animal movement. And we are very grateful for their time and effort coming here to lead a discussion with us about the future and perspectives on movement science. And today we will have a true group discussion. As you can see on the screen, that all the four authors on this paper is here today, and they will give us a joint presentation for 30 minutes, then open the floor for discussion. So Jennifer, please take over.
Thanks everybody for coming. This, I think, is one of the few benefits that we've realized in the last year with pandemics, being able to have these virtual discussions like this that I think maybe would have been less compelling or less interesting when we had more face-to-face options. So I'm going to start us off, and then we'll hear from Harvey Miller and Somaya Dodge, and then Gil Borer. So next slide. So just to give sort of an overview of where this paper came from, we were sort of in various GI science and other conferences, we would often have discussions at different movement analysis related talks, and we noted that there was a disconnect, often a disconnect between people who studied human movement and people who studied animal movement, even though there are certainly some key differences, but there are lots of commonalities and similarities in how to study these things. With animal movement, it was sort of in some ways lagging behind, because often with animal movement, the main questions were as simple as where is the animal moving and why is it moving there at the individual level. But then it's also really important to understand animal movement to better understand things like habitat and resource use and infectious disease spread, as well as social behaviors such as mating and territoriality and predation. And then movement of individual animals is then the link between sort of population level processes. Whereas with human movement, it's been more of a top-down approach where you're interested, or the questions are usually focused on how humans move through natural and built environments in order to conduct certain activities, which we were able to know about. So there was less of a need to find out where humans are moving and why they're moving. And it was more about how to better plan infrastructure like transportation and cities to better facilitate accessibility, as well as the impacts of where they were moving or mobility on environment, health, social capital, and well-being. Next slide, please. So one of the things that that not just we discovered, but one of the things that has been apparent in the last 4 or 5 years is that there's been a huge increase in the amount of moving data that are available. And so not just the actual locations, which are increasingly available at higher and higher spatial and temporal resolutions, but we can often get sort of ancillary data about the movement. So environmental context, wind speed, all kinds of other sort of information about where the individual, the object is moving. So in the past, we didn't have very much, it was very low resolution data. In the animal context, it was often people actually observing and writing in notebooks. So you might get 5 or 6 or maybe 10 observations or locations a day for certain, this was often done with primates who were followed in groups. Whereas with humans, you often got more rich data on travel diaries and surveys, but now we're able to collect these data pretty automatically, and we've got a ton of information, but it's often now a lot of data, but less of the additional or ancillary data, although that's also improving. One of the things that's been an issue is that while we've had an increase in the amount of data available, both the quality and the quantity of the data, the analytical methods have often lagged behind. I've noticed this, and I'm more interested in analyzing interactions between animals. And that in particular, when I started doing this stuff 10 years ago, a lot of the metrics that were used to quantify interactions were based on what was developed 30 years ago. And that was just a completely different paradigm of data availability, where there were just fewer observations. And some of the metrics, like the half-weight association index, which is still used in social network analysis, it's an index that ranges from 0 to 1, and it has a denominator that's based on the total number of observations. So when you have a huge amount of observations, the denominator is going to be inflated, and it's going to be difficult to get a number approaching 1, even if there is relatively a considerable amount of interaction happening. Another thing that has been an issue in modeling animal interactions is that doesn't happen with modeling human interactions, is that it's been somewhat standard that you put GPS collars on 5 or 6 or 7 individuals, collect the data for a year or two, and then use a sort of out-of-date metric to quantify their interaction, and then make inferences about the species based on how 5 individuals are interacting. And I think that type of study design would never apply for humans. So I think that we are just recently, the analytical methods are starting to catch up with the data that are available. And I'll just say one other thing that is becoming more of a problem. It's always been an issue with human movement data, but it's becoming an issue with animal movement data, is privacy issues. So different privacy issues, but lots of things that have been in the news recently with human privacy issues with movement data. With animals, there are the obvious things with, you can't track rhinoceroses or other endangered animals and then make the locations available. But there are some more benign applications where you might be interested in ecotourism and finding out where animals are, or you might be interested in movement of predators around your livestock. This is going to become more of an issue with radio and sonar transmitters are much more easily intercepted, and people who aren't supposed to have that data could get access to the data. Next slide, please, May. So this is just an overview of some of the workshops that some of us have either been involved in as organizers or as participants, starting with the first one that I went to. And I think, Somi, this was one that you co-organized, and this was just a real eye-opener for me, the 2010 workshop associated with the GI Science Conference in Zurich. And then you can see that we started having these movement-related workshops at least every couple of years since then, often associated with a GI Science conference, but sometimes standalone multi-day workshops that were associated with animal movement collections like Move Bank, or with some other conference, like I think, let's see, this International Statistical Ecology Conference. There's been a Dagstuhl workshop and a Lawrence Center workshop that have been dedicated to these 4 or 5 day dedicated to analyzing movement from different factions of humans and people who collect the data on human movement and animal movement. Next slide, please. So then this paper culminated from a series of 2 workshops that Gil and Harvey and I organized that was funded by the NSF. And this really started with these conversations that we had, where we noted that there were people who, and I will often say humans and animals, but what I'm really talking about is people who study human movement and versus animal movement. And there was often this sort of dedicated animal movement analysis and human movement analysis in spite of the commonalities. So we submitted this proposal to NSF, and we got funded to organize 2 workshops that were explicitly focused on bringing together people who studied animal movement and human movement together. And we identified 2 sort of topics of interest that would benefit from this interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary approach. The one on interactions was held here in Austin in November 2016. I think those of you who were there, you'll probably never forget, it was the day after the election in 2016. So it was a pretty rough beginning, but we pulled it together. And then 6 months later, we had the second workshop focused on environmental context of movement in Columbus.
Yeah, hi. This is Harvey Miller, and I'm going to talk through the next few slides, and I'm just going to go through some of the lessons we learned from these 2 workshops. And many of these or all of these are summarized in the paper. I'm just going to hit like a few of the high points. I will say that these workshops truly were meetings of 2 worlds. You know, people from 2 different domains who have been conducting parallel play in very similar types of scientific questions, just in different domains. And we did discover how much commonality we have, but we also discovered some big differences that we think needed to be bridged. And so the first kind of difference that we saw between the animal movement and human mobility domains was 2 very different approaches, canonical approaches to the same problem. With animal movement ecology, they have the step selection framework where we start with steps and observe that, and then infer what are the activities that are being conducted by the individuals. In human mobility science, we start with the activities. We treat transportation as a derived demand, and then infer everything else, including the actual movement itself. And that's a framework known as activity-based analysis, which is the predominant paradigm now in transportation science. And this is something we think that there are cross-fertilization lessons that can be gained from both sides. In human mobility, in particular, there is now more focus on modeling movement outside of cars and moving things like movements using active transportation modes, such as walking, biking, and public transit. And in that case, a step selection framework looking at how crowd dynamics evolve, how pedestrian dynamics, how people operate within mixed traffic becomes really important. With animal movement ecology, there's a possibility now of the development of biosensors that we could start to infer some of the internal states of animals and try to derive what are the reasons behind the steps that are being selected. Another one is the role of real-world experimentations, and with all the data we have now, there's the ability for persistent observation in environments, which means that we can enable quasi-natural experiments that are either prospective or retrospective. What I mean by prospective is that, well, we manipulate something in the environment, or if we know something's going to happen, we set up the sensing devices and we can observe what the reactions are, either among animals or humans, when this change in policy or disruption or some kind of change in an environment or infrastructure. With retrospective, if we're gathering data on an ongoing basis, when something happens, we can go back and form a quasi-experimental design from the data. Now, I think the big challenge here is that there are some really well-developed statistical techniques now for quasi-natural experiments, but based on my experience, they're all very intricate, fragile, and with 1 or 2 exceptions, don't handle spatial or moving objects data. So that's an area where we need to develop in order to build this into our science. There is a question we discussed about whether or not we really need to talk about individual movement or collective movement. Do we really care about characterizing individual movement to a high degree or collective patterns? Collective patterns certainly are very interesting and have a bigger impact. And also they're easy to predict, but there's an argument about that we should start with individual movement and work up from first principles to talk about collective patterns. Okay, next slide, please, May. Different states of movement. This is an area where, or different scales of movement, excuse me. This is an area where human mobility scientists were learning a lot from the animal movement ecologists, because animal movement ecologists are good at handling collective behaviors like flocking and schooling. When in human mobility science, we tend to treat the decisions as independent. The only time we get into collective movement are things like traffic behavior and pedestrians. And again, this is something that will become more important as we start to model human movement outside the automobile and as they move through built in natural environments using active transportation modes. Prediction of movement, of course, is very important at both the individual and collective levels. The general question is, how do we predict trajectories, individual or collective movement patterns in space and time across different temporal and spatial scales? And validation and calibration of methods. We now have the ability to calibrate and parameterize models based on knowledge constructed from actual environments. And there are hanging open questions such as, how does scale affect the calculation of movement parameters? A question also that was raised during these workshops is, do we need a grand theory of movement among animal movement ecologists? There's so many species with different types of motivations and behaviors and reactions to the environment. And with human, there are many different types of humans, of course, but also many different travel reasons. So is movement science something that's unified by a grand theory or just by the general domain questions and methods? And then finally, we noted that we need to talk about what are the relationships to grand societal challenges such as climate crisis, ecosystem dynamics, sustainability, resilience, the spread of infectious disease, environmental health, habitat preservations. There's need for basic knowledge here, of course, and basic scientific discovery, but really for this field to mature and especially attract funding, we need to talk about, well, so what? Why do we need an integrated science of movement? How does this help us address some of the big challenges that we're facing as a society? Now, in following up what's happened since that paper, I want to note this paper that was published just recently this year in 2021 by Urshika Demisar, Jed Long, and a few other very clever people. That was a direct response to our movement science paper. And what they did is that we took a top-down approach where we basically assembled experts and formulated what we thought was a framework for this burgeoning science of movement. They took a bottom-up approach and looked at the literature and created basically a unified framework to summarize all this literature in both domains, and I really highly recommend this paper. And they also addressed a challenge I talked about in the previous slide. Do we need a grand theory of movement? And the answer in this paper was yes. And there you see on the screen at least a general framework describing different types of movement or all types of movement in both animal and human domains. And then one of the great kind of moments for me was during these workshops, seeing the animal movement ecologists be turned on by some new ideas from human mobility science, in particular time geography, which everyone knows is one of my favorite topics. And the animal movement ecologists really got time geography very quickly and understood some of its implications, including the space-time prism. And what I'm showing here is some of my recent follow-up work with one of my students, Young Yeagle, who just finished his PhD. This is yet unpublished, but we were looking at using the space-time prism and different manifestations of it to try to capture the context of movement using a more principled way than just arbitrary points or buffers. And we did find that it does provide superior and more resilient measurements of context in analyzing movement behavior. And in this case, we were working with animal movement data to show you some of the crossover work that's beginning to emerge, because I'm traditionally a human mobility scientist. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Somi.
Yes, as Harvey said, time geography has been instrumental in recent advancements of movement analytics methods that can be used across domains of animal movement and human mobility. For example, we can use the space-time prism in methods for analyzing interaction between mobile individuals and for contact tracing purposes. As Jennifer said, interaction analysis has relied so far, and most of the methods rely on proximity between the individuals or the overlap between their activity spaces. For example, the current contact tracing technologies implemented in Google and Apple mobile devices work based on the proximity of individuals in space and time. In such methods, contacts are quantified as point-to-point distances between the individuals or the intersection of their Bluetooth ranges. And therefore, it needs that the individuals are tracked at the same time, and basically they stay close to each other. These measures rely on synchronous movement of individuals and can be sometimes less effective when individuals are not tracked together synchronously. Also, delayed interaction has not been considered previously in these approaches. Delayed interaction is one of the of interest of many applications. For example, in predator-prey interaction analysis, or in identifying human exposure to airborne pathogens which can stay in the air for quite some time, or for example, in the case of SARS-CoV-2. Time geography can provide a unique opportunity to identify temporally delayed interaction in space and time, as it considers the potential location that are accessible to the individuals along their movement path. In recent works, dynamic interaction has been modeled using the intersection between the potential path areas, or in short PPA, as the projection of the space-time prism on the 2D geographic space, along that we can quantify that along the trajectories of mobile individuals. This is a paper with Long and Ness, and that they showed if you intersect the PPA of mobile individuals over time, you can identify the interaction or potential interactions. If we intersect the PPAs over time at the same time, we will have concurrent interactions. However, a delayed interaction or asynchronous interaction in space and time can be identified based on the temporally lagged intersection of these potential path areas over time. So time geography is generic and can be applied to model the movement of both animals and humans. For example, here I'd like to show some results of a recent paper published in CUS on applying time geography to identify concurrent and delayed interaction between individuals using human and animal tracking data. First, we applied the time geographic approach to identify interaction in a human social network. Specifically here, we are using high-resolution GPS tracking data of 402 individuals from 176 different households in San Jose. And then we compare the result to the proximity-based approach. So as you can see in these figures, the networks are quite different for the proximity-based approach and the PPA-based approach. The proximity-based approach can significantly underestimate the number of contacts between individuals and is heavily impacted by the buffer size that we choose and the temporal scale of the data. However, time geography provides a more robust method to identify potential synchronous as well as delayed interactions between mobile individuals. As you can see on the top left figure, the proximity-based network shows a much less rate of interaction between these moving individuals. Despite the fact that actually based on the survey data, we know that these individuals had interaction either with people within their household or outside their household. So the lighter colors shows less interaction, less connection between the nodes, and the darker colors shows nodes that have more interaction. Another observation is that as we increase the time delays, the method can detect similar spatial behavior in human social networks. For example, you can see cluster groups of nodes that interact with each other more, and that would be people who share the same spatial patterns. For example, going to the same gym or same grocery store, but however with a long delay or some temporal delay. In this paper, we also show that the technique can be applied to study intra and interspecific interaction between animals, in this case, tigers and leopards. For example, here are the results of the two tigers and and one leopard. The two tigers are shown in red and green. The green is a male tiger and the red is a female tiger. The male is a younger subadult tiger. And the blue basically is the leopard that shares some parts of the boundary between the two tigers, but also is contained within the home range of one tiger. So basically the result shows that the two tigers really have a direct interaction and often visit the location visited by the other tiger with a delay of more than 3 hours. Most of the delayed interactions between the two tigers occur up to 2 to 3 weeks of each other, when the tiger scent appears to be the strongest. According to the field observations done by our collaborators who are field biologists, the scent marks are detected and often oversprayed up to 3 weeks later to serve to demarcate the territorial boundaries, while reducing the likelihood of direct encounters that can result in serious injuries to both animals and sometimes mortal injuries to the loser. Here, the collaboration with our field biologists was key to interpret our results and also see that the result from time geography approach can confirm these field observations. And I should also note that the unique problem with this data was that we didn't have a high resolution GPS tracking data of tigers and leopards. So we had every 4 hour or 1 hour data, or the tiger and the different animals were tracked with different sampling rates. So time geography was very helpful here to model the accessible areas to each individual animal to be able to intersect and identify potential interaction. The leopard tends to stay away from the tiger's visited locations up to 3 to 6 hours. The animals happen to visit the locations visited by the other animal with a delay of 24 hours between leopards and tigers. So that shows that the leopard stays away and avoids the tiger because otherwise it gets killed. As Harvey showed, it is important to use the space-time prism to contextualize these interaction patterns with information on the geography and the environmental conditions of the area to be able to better identify the nature of these interactions. Jennifer.
So I'll just talk a little bit about a paper that I've done that also continues this exploration of quantifying interactions. This was just accepted in transactions in GIS, and so sort of the other side of the framework of analyzing or trying to detect interactions with PPA, which does a great job at exploring potential interactions, or the where they might occur and the relative amount of them. I was interested in trying to find a way that might be able to detect movement that is related to interactions, especially as movement data are increasingly available at higher resolution. You can actually calculate a bunch of different movement parameters, and the idea is that there are behaviors or movement behaviors that are associated with interactions. And this is where it gets a little bit tricky, because interactions is that can refer to a range of different behaviors, from physical contact that might be used to study disease spread, to simply sharing resources, or just mere awareness of each other. So this is this is a study that I used from MoveBank, a nice data set on 1 hour resolution black-backed jackals in Etosha National Park in Namibia. And I was looking at whether you could detect movement-related behaviors, looking at movement parameters ranging from absolute angle, relative angle, step length, speed, and then a couple of more complicated movement parameters. And this came from a paper in a series of analytical methods called behavior change point analysis, that presumes that you can identify, or you can help to infer an animal's behavior based on movement parameters. So things like if an animal is taking a lot of short steps and with rapidly changing relative angles, that might suggest that they're foraging, whereas very long steps and sort of faster movement might suggest some kind of migration-related behavior. So some examples of these more complex movement parameters, the one listed, or the one that I have little examples of here is the persistence index, which is just the cosine of the relative angle. So you can see it ranges from 1, which is pretty approximately a straight line movement, to -1, which is very erratic oscillating movement, and then a pi of 0 is perpendicular movement. And then if you multiply the persistence index by speed, then you get the persistence velocity. So these are movement parameters that have been used in behavioral change point analysis for just characterizing an individual's movement, that are a little bit more powerful than the typical movement parameters like just the angle or the step length, because they're capable of describing 3 of these important characteristics: the speed, the directional persistence, and variability and change, that might be more powerful at detecting behavior or allowing you to make inferences about movement-related behaviors. So in this study, I looked at these different movement parameters, as well as Jed Long's suite of path-based similarity metrics, to see whether what looked like interaction that was based on space and proximity in space and time, whether that was characterized by differences in some of these movement parameters. And since interaction is a far more complicated process than foraging or migration or resting, I found that there were, in most cases, PIs close to 1 and close to -1 were more often characterized with what looked like an interaction in space and time. Sometimes the path-based similarity metrics, the DI suite, sometimes they were good at detecting interaction behaviors, but it's a very specific type of interaction behavior. So basically 2 individuals traveling together, because often in this illustration, 2 individuals are sort of coming from completely different parts of the study area to either maybe meet at a carcass or some sort of water hole or a similar resource, and then move away from each other. But this is something that's detected by PI values that range from 1 to -1 vary in subsequent steps. So one of the things, and sorry, May, this is something that would have been, this is going to be a bunch of little animation. So one thing that has been improved in the last 10 years or so is that there weren't very many ways to analyze, process, and visualize movement data until 10 years or so ago. And now there's a huge number of kind of standalone packages in R. And then if you want to go ahead and just do a couple of these. So these are just some of the ones that I found that do some kind of processing or analysis or visualization. And this is a recent paper from 2018 that describes or summarizes what this was in 2018, and they found 58 different R packages that do some combination of processing and visualizing or analyzing movement data. So even though these data all have in common that they're X and Y, and they have X, Y, and time information associated with them, of the 58 packages that they identified, they found that about 2/3 of them had some sort of commonalities or some kind of dependence in the functions, but 1/3 of them were really sort of independent and often redundant. And even though the data or the type of data was the same based on X, Y, and T, some of these packages involved creating a different sort of trajectory format that didn't work in the other packages. So now we have a lot of really cool movement analysis software packages available, but the problem is, and it's not that bad of a problem, but the issue is that they sort of developed independently. So there's a lot of redundancy and inconsistency in the way that they can be used together. And then I think we go to Gil.
Hi, so I want to present another challenge which is rising. So now that we have many solutions to collect data, and we have many solutions to analyze data. And as we said, movement and mobility research is kind of exploding. We're starting to run into difficulties of putting data together. There's a typical critical difficulty in collecting movement data, and the outcome of which, so first is typically expensive and time consuming and administratively challenging. So imagine collecting mobility data of people. You need to gather agreement from the people that the data will be collected, or it's some kind of cell phone data that needs to be purchased. Often you get the data from a particular system, like a railroad, and then it's very regionally limited. Similarly, with animals, the tags are expensive, so you are limited in how many animals you can afford actually keeping track of. So the people that do those studies are motivated by very particular questions, and the studies tend to be very focused on a single species, maybe two species, very particular populations, very limited area. And almost never studies are funded for more than 3 years. So these are all short-term data sets. So there's a challenge is how do we go above that? So collectively in the world, there is terabytes, petabytes of movement data collected about movement of many things over decades by now. But it's very hard to put those things together. And one solution that we've recently proposed is make a collaborative archive. Now, the challenge in a collaborative archive is to make everyone participate in a way that has the same metadata. The data is completely, everyone's data is completely exchangeable throughout the system, but at the same time preserve data ownership and preserve data access rights, because not all data can be public. In humans, you are very limited in what you can post. There are very strict privacy limitations. With animals, you are very limited by the landowner permission of what data can be posted of what was collected on their land. For example, Native American tribes are extremely sensitive to data ownership. And also you are limited with endangered species. If you collected rhino data or you have a live rhino streaming its location, you absolutely cannot post that, or that rhino will be hunted 5 minutes later. So the challenge is to create an environment where everyone can share the data, but at the same time control who accesses the data and what they do with the data. And one such solution is MoveBank Archive platform. So we recently, led by Sarah Davidson from MoveBank, we developed an archive platform. So MoveBank is a platform for animal movement research. Anyone can use it. Anyone can put their data there and keep it completely hidden. If you are joining an archive within MoveBank, there will be a link from your data set to the archive, and that link will also specify who should be contacted to use the data and what level of data exposure that linked data will provide. So the regulating the metadata and data access is done by MoveBank, whereas linking it to an archive is done by that archive platform. So when you log into the archive, you can see a list of all the data that's available through the archive. You can see the metadata. Some of it is open and available. Some of it needs some extra steps to actually obtain the data by clearing your intention of what you want to do or who are you and who will use the data. The first archive that we made compiled all the Arctic animal movement data that we can put our hands on. It includes tens of millions of animal movement observations from more than 30 years with many individuals streaming live. So as we speak, this archive is continually expanding and growing with more researchers that are joining the archive with past data and with streaming data that updates on the fly. This includes marine data, terrestrial data, birds, mammals, and with that we could study the effects of climate change on animal movement in the Arctic in ways that couldn't be done before. So this was recently published in Science. There's a reference to the paper here. We basically looked at very long-term patterns of movement, very large-scale pattern of movement, and compared movement patterns across different mammals at different trophic levels. And again, typically a single movement archive will contain a single species or two related.
Gail, Harvey, and Jennifer discussed, our data is growing and getting more diverse, and the need for collaborative efforts is increasing. These things necessitate the development of human-centered approaches to advance the science of movement. In both human mobility and movement ecology, it is essential to empower the human in the loop when we study movement. Different players participating in science of movement include domain scientists, data owners, developers of methods, modelers, and analysts. We argue for a research paradigm following the human-centered artificial intelligence framework by Schneiderman. In such paradigm, basically our computational tools should provide an optimal balance and capacity in terms of computer automation and human control to enhance performance in knowledge discovery from basically to empower and enhance our performance in knowledge discovery from large and complex movement data. A human-centered approach ensures that the human has a central role in knowledge construction, and the process is not fully automated through machine learning algorithms. An example of such research emphasizing input from human was just presented by Jennifer on interaction analysis. It is important to consider basically the role of what we can play in terms of domain scientists and developers in bringing our knowledge also to the game when we develop methods. A key component in a human-centered movement analytics is visualization, which can facilitate interdisciplinary collaborations with domain experts and support visual reasoning, hypothesis generation, inference, and interpretation of analytical findings. The participation of the human is also instrumental for the validation of the outcomes and considering ethical challenges in movement research. For example, only the human can assess and account for inherent bias in our algorithms and data. To conclude and summarize, moving forward, we hope for more comprehensive and properly archived open data, as well as development of methods that are reproducible and transferable, and also tools that are can be used by both scientists in human mobility domains and animal movement studies to advance the science of movement. Through human-centered approaches, our computational tools can also better leverage visualization to facilitate interdisciplinary collaboration and optimize human input in the process. And with that, I would like to invite you to submit your work and your vision for the future of our field to the next GI Science workshop on advancing movement data science, which will be happening virtually on September 27th this year at the GI Science Conference. This is basically the 10th anniversary of the workshop that was in Zurich, and that was organized by Patrick Laube, and Patrick Laube is also a co-organizer of this workshop. And another co-organizer, I believe, was Ross Purvis. So I was just a PhD student back then. Yeah, we are looking forward for short vision papers and short research papers or work in progress. And I will put the link to the submission in the chat box. So thanks for your time, and we look forward to your questions.
Wow, thank you very much. Even though we are running out of time, but the presentation is just so engaging. I didn't put a stop sign in front, and it's really wonderful talk and very informative. Now we open the floor for questions, and if you can raise your hand, then I can call your name, so you can talk to the presenter. So Pranwa Amaya, I apologize if I get your name wrong. Please go ahead.
Well, that's perfectly fine. Yeah, my name is Prawan Amatya. And yeah, the presentation was really mesmerizing, I would say. I mean, that would be the really nice word. And I'm very impressed with the Move Bank movement because I'm really interested in the human mobility part. And I'm also trying to pursue my PhD on that field if possible, and that's what I'm looking for. And my actually main question is, like, I saw a lot of the data being collected through GPS, right? And my concern was, is it possible at this moment, using the like geostationary satellite and using the like satellite video image, can we track the human movement or animal movement? And I do understand that there would be privacy issues and or the protection of the endangered species. But I think it is being done on different countries like Dubai or for example, they are tracking the movement of the aircraft. So I don't know if the resolution would be enough for the human mobility or animal movement tracking. So I was really curious about that part.
So basically, remote sensing technology, how applicable they are to monitor human movement. Any take on that?
I'll start and just talk about the human mobility part of that. It's difficult to capture humans themselves. I mean, we can measure vehicles using remote sensing and those type of techniques, like planes, ships, cars, trucks. But we really want to get a human movement, not vehicle movement. And this is part of the problem with mobility science up until very recently, that we were biased towards things we can count easily, which are cars and vehicles. And a lot of traditional mobility science is focused on that. And therefore, our science and our policy prescriptions were basically oriented towards vehicles and not human mobility. And that this needs to change now because our current human mobility systems are not sustainable, and we have to shift our focus away from vehicles and towards people. So I think that's going to be a challenge when it comes to human mobility and where we need to be in the future.
Yes,
I can also add that in terms of human mobility, so as Harvey said, not with satellite imagery, but maybe with mobile devices. Nowadays, we have a lot of companies sharing like aggregate mobility, and this is based on cell phones that they see. But the problem here is that we are counting people who are carrying cell phone, and we are counting people who chose or not knowingly turned on their location services, either using an app or based on their platform that they are using. So we are counting people as they carry devices, but we are not counting people who are moving and not having mobile devices. In terms of animal movement, there are some studies using drone tracking, like imagery with the drone to track animals, but these are so domain specific and for specific research questions that you want to exactly follow the animal and try to capture or identify different animals from an image. I don't know, Gil, do you have animal movement based on satellite, the recent satellite initiative by Movement people, that has been also a new development, right?
Right. So the point is, typically you do not detect the animals with the satellite directly, but you use the satellite to convey the tracker signal. So it's very similar to humans opening the location app on their cell phone, only the animals tend to, and you can actually use the cell phone transmission towers to relay the GPS signal from an animal tag. But then in many cases, the animals roam around when there's no cell phone signal, and you want the signal to be sent via satellite where it's available globally and not be reliant on the cell phone transmission signal. The detection of the animal themselves is, I don't know of anyone that did it. Maybe it's possible somehow, but people don't find the animal through a remote sensing image, but use a satellite to convey a GPS location from an animal.
Mm-hmm. Okay, any other questions? Before people raise their hands, and I will take the opportunity to fit in my question. I think that my exposure to movement analysis, they seem to fall into three categories. One is looking at the geometry to look at trajectories and trajectory clustering or similarity between trajectory in terms of shapes and turns. And the second category is the semantic analysis to look at like how points of interest associated with stops and move, and then how that related to geographical features. And then the third is applied time geography framework to looking at accessibility and interaction. But all three seems to assume there is an empty space. Less so for the semantic approach that they were looking at different geographical features, but none of the approach is really looking at accessibility or geographical barriers or geographical facilitators that converge movement naturally to each other. And in time geography, very few really talk about capability constraints or authoritative constraint in terms of movement trajectories that we observe in the data. So can you comment on what you feel about the overall analysis directions for movement and what will be the urgent needs for more research?
Well, I think traditionally that animal movement ecologists have been ahead of human mobility scientists in terms of context. Context has been traditionally more important in animal movement ecology. In human mobility science, we used to treat flows and movements as completely abstract, even devoid of any geographic context. But I think that's changing. We just have so much data now on points of interest, social data, and so much more data on infrastructure. And we're also able to capture qualitative data as well now, geo-narratives, things like that. So I think in human mobility analysis and accessibility analysis, we're getting a lot better at capturing context. And part of it, again, is a shift away from just looking at vehicles in human mobility science and looking at actual human movement, and especially looking at the heterogeneity in that movement. The fact that with that it's not all undifferentiated flow, and different types of transportation policies and infrastructure benefit some people at the expense of others. In other words, humans are very heterogeneous in their movement needs and wants. So I think we're coming along in human mobility science in that regard. But it's been a more recent development.
Thank you. We do have two more hands up, so I will just read from the top. Madel Vaziri, apologize, pronounced your name wrong.
It's okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry. On the previous question, the first question that somebody asked was about the remote sensing. I mean, with the advanced technology, if everybody has a phone on them, why do we even need that? And I know a lot of data providers provide such data as granular as you want, and I don't think there is a need for that. But my question was more of, there are aggregated data level, let's say at block city levels, that can tell us how much people are gathering in this space and basically in any space based on the mobility data that is available. Can we do something about how much interaction is happening there with that kind of data?
Well, I guess, do you want to take that, Somi, or?
I was just going to say, in terms of aggregate mobility indices, you can identify like interaction with a space based on space, like place-based interaction. But interaction between people, like individuals, is harder to quantify, although you can quantify the amount of or the number of individuals within a contained space, right? And then somehow assess or estimate the probability of interaction. So that would be one way to look at. I don't know, Jennifer, do you want to add anything maybe, or Harvey?
Yeah, I'll just basically that, you know, and if you think about the way that I've been studying interactions with animals, it's really different compared to how, you know, if you think of COVID and how that's transmitted, that the stuff that I've been working on with inferring interaction based on movement differences, that's not really relevant, because this type of the interaction that you need to spread something infectious like COVID, you don't need to detect, there doesn't need to be any difference in actual movement. So it really is back to the, you know, slightly easier way to detect interactions, which is just similarity in time and space. And then that's really, really dependent on the resolution of your data, right? Because then you definitely want something that is high enough resolution to actually get at what would be meaningful contact or meaningful proximity.
I would also add that, I would also add that some of these companies who provide aggregate mobility indices, they are computing this data based on individual cell phone tracking data, right? So they also, like Cubic, for example, provide exposure index or contact index, something like that, that basically estimate the number of times that individual come close to 50 meters of distance. So you can get that as aggregate index from these companies too.
And I was just going to add, if you pay. That's one of the big issues.
Yes.
I mean, I have access to all the streetlight data for Ohio, census block group, OD flow matrices on an hourly basis. They're providing that as part of their license to the Ohio Department of Transportation and to universities in Ohio. But if I want anything beyond that, I better have a pretty deep pocket to pay for it.
Yeah, we had to pay for Cubic, and Streetlight so far has been free, but for more information, you have to pay.
Right.
Yeah, I guess for the animal study is even more challenge, because animals have smell and their vision is much better than humans. So the longer distance interactions should be implied based on their senses than the direct interactions based on locations. And we have one more question by George Percival. George?
Thank you. Question relates to an article that was published in Nature last month. The title was Universal Visitation Law of Human Mobility. I can see Professor Miller smiling already, because I think, I wonder, especially given your, Professor Miller, lessons learned presentation, different scales of movement, including flocking and schooling and prediction of movement, looking for general rules. That paper goes in a quite different direction, lot less context, quite a bit more aggregation, complexity science, complex adaptive systems, but makes the case that there is this universal law. Have you seen the paper? Do you have any perspective on that?
Yes, I do. I've seen the paper, and basically what it says is that with greater distance, the frequency of visits decreases. And if that's a new universal law, a lot of us are surprised at that, because basically it's the gravity model, which dates back a century. And that's all that result, that universal law is nothing more than space interaction theory restated. And yeah, so it's not a new discovery. And also I would add that, universal law, sure, yeah, that basic relationship probably does hold universally, but it's the heterogeneity, the variation in that regularity that's really the most interesting part. Just declaring, well, with greater distance, you're going to visit something less frequently. I'll just leave it at that and say I'm not impressed by the universal law. It's something we've known for almost a century.
Appreciate the comment.
That's why I smiled.
Very well. Thank you for the question. Our time is up. There's just one new hand come up. Do you, presenters, do you mind to answer one last question? Okay, great. So Muhammad, go ahead.
Hello, thank you for this presentation and this opportunity. I have a question related to the human interaction and with the animal movement. We know that the human activities might have affected the animal movement. For example, the garbage or the signals of the TV or the radio stations. But is there any study that has characterized the human mobility, characterize how the human mobility has affected the animal movement?
Yeah, Ted Long is on this webinar. He's watching. He's done some work in this area. I suggest seeking out his work. Shout
Also,
out to
there
Jed.
are, yeah, and also there are other studies looking at the reduced mobility of people during COVID and the impact on animal activity. So there are a lot of studies on the intersection between human movement and impact on animal behavior.
So I don't have exactly the link, but somewhere in the movement blogosphere, there's a self-assembled group of animal researchers that are collaborating in an archive to study the effects of reduced human mobility during COVID on animal movement. I'm sure if you Google COVID movement, you'll find it.
Yeah, there was a paper, I think it was in Science or Nature, recently published. It was like a vision piece.
So Oscar, I think you probably have input for this question. We cannot hear you. Do you have you unmute? All right. I cannot unmute you, so. But...
I can chime in if you want, May, on what Urshka's doing.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so there are a bunch of people, as Gil said, and they've started to try and seek out more collaborations, I think, with people that have expertise on the human mobility side for trying to understand the impact of human activity on animal movement. And it's kind of really interesting work. A lot of it's quite global in nature right now, so it's maybe very speculative about what we'll find. But I think as it moves into more sort of targeted studies, it'll be interesting to see the kind of data sets and methods that are used. And I know Song's been involved in this as well with the US group. So really interesting kind of opportunities, I think, for people with expertise at the intersection of these kinds of areas to be, you know, seek out some collaborations with wildlife researchers in your units for sure.
Yeah, thank you, Jed. All right.
And here's the link to the paper. I just posted the link to the paper.
Thank you, Somi. Well, thank you everybody for this very informative session. I hope this also excites some research interest from the audience on this topical area. Well, thank you, Harvey, Jennifer, Somi, and Gil for the engaging discussions. And I will package this and then post it on YouTube so that we will be able to share broadly. Thank you very much, and then have a great day.
Thank you.